One thing that I found kind of surprising when you published this paper is the idea that Japan is so vulnerable, because I think a lot of people think of Japan, as one of the stronger nations in the Indo-Pacific when it comes to being resilient against the Chinese Communist Party, and partly because the CCP has always kind of treated Japan as an enemy. So it would seem that their political warfare tactics wouldn't be as easily accepted there as in, for example, South Korea or some other countries that we've seen. But you're saying that it is actually quite vulnerable, right?
It is vulnerable. China and Japan go back their relationship because of propinquity. They're right next to each other. And so their relationship in conflict, in wars and invasion, it goes back 2,000 years. And so, yes, there's a certain acceptance of certain cultural influence on Japan, which is accepted and appreciated. But there's also an understanding that that China has a very malign attitude in many cases against Japan and the Japanese people. Fairly recent Pew poll shows that about 85% of the Japanese people don't very much like and certainly don't trust China. So the Japanese people are, I think, quite wise in this regard, but that doesn't mean that they fully appreciate and understand the scope of political warfare. And how it works out. It's a very much a combined arms warfare approach that China takes against every country, the United States, Japan, all our friends and allies, and they the means that they use with their massive organization, very powerfully resourced political warfare apparatus, and the top level direction by Xi Jinping himself. His dad was a political warfare officer. He understands how the United Front system works and how valuable it is. You can win everything you want through political warfare. The Japanese people, like the American people, know and understand some of China's malign influence. They don't have a good appreciation of just the breadth and scope, the depth of what comprises political warfare, of the war being fought against them on a daily basis. Japanese people don't, American people don't. Japanese elected officials don't. A lot of policymakers don't. Same thing in America. So we're running in parallel vulnerabilities in this regard. That's why education about political warfare, what you're doing in China Unscripted, is so important, because you help educate about the insidious, malign nature of China's political warfare.
So, big picture, I guess what we need to understand is what should the U.S. and Japan do to prevent this 2040 scenario you've described? And how is the Chinese Communist Party using political warfare to prevent that from happening?
Okay, well, let's take your second question first. Let's look at what they're doing, and then we can discuss some of the steps that the U.S. and Japan. I'm glad you put it that way, because we need, and Japan needs us. Alone, goes back, to a Revolutionary War concept. We can all hang together. We can hang separately. Better that we stick together. We're a lot stronger. So let's parse out for a little while what exactly the political warfare operations are being conducted by China against Japan, because that's an essential part of it. A lot of our diplomats and general and flag officers, naval officers, admirals, and general officers in the Army, Marine Corps, and Air Force that I've met don't really understand political warfare. DoD officials don't understand what it is. So let's parse out some of what's going on against Japan, because if you don't know that you're under attack, you're not going to fight back effectively. By the time you find out exactly what they did to you, you're in a POW camp. Okay, and that's if you're lucky. If you were one of the ones who lived, then you're in a POW camp, or you're basically a vassal state again, as I've described many of the countries in Southeast Asia. So let's look at first military intimidation. What it is that China's doing against Japan is massive. the using not just the PLA, People's Liberation Army, and their incursions in circumnavigation around Japan of attack air groups and of naval surface groups and of ballistic missile submarines, but also the use of the maritime militia. Those gray zone, very difficult to combat because we haven't come up with a good strategies, good policies to combat that. The gray zone operations is where they win. They never have to go to conventional warfare. They never have to use all those weapons that they built, those amphibious assault ships, those destroyers, those cruisers that they've been building at a massive scale, where they're going to be double the size of the U.S. Navy. The PLA Navy will be double the size of the U.S. Navy in about now a little less than 9 years.
Real quick, for those listening, can you give a brief explanation of gray zone warfare, just so they know what you mean?
Sure. It's where the top militia comes up and edges out the Japanese fishermen. Well, the maritime militia is basically a militarized force, where the Coast Guard, the Chinese Coast Guard, which is a military force in China, comes in and backs up that maritime militia, enforcing them out where they go into the Senkaku Islands. I go to the Chinese have a name for it, but the Japanese and American name is the Senkakus. China wants them. They're next on the hit parade after they get Taiwan, maybe before the short, sharp war, as they've called it, that they're going to conduct to get the Senkakus. Well, that's going to probably start out as a conflict involving the maritime militia or the so-called fishing fleets. It's going to be civilians from China going in initially, because Japan, the U.S., our mentality is, you can't use military forces to block civilians who've occupied the Senkakus. Okay, so those are below the threshold of what the U.S. and Japan would think would require a military response. That's the gray zone operations. China knows, as Russia does, they work together. Push as far as you can to the red line that you can expect a military response. And then if you don't see any backbone in Washington, in the State Department, coming out of the White House, then you push beyond the red line and you keep pushing. That's the nature of the CCP. They will keep pushing those gray zone operations until they get so much more than they thought they could initially get away with. So hopefully that answers your question in general about gray zone operations. They'll use their propaganda organs. In that paper, Japan 2040, I give just some of the recent headlines. They're horrifying. No U.S. newspaper would publish headlines as threatening as what you see daily in China Daily, in PLA Daily, in Xinhua, aimed at Japan. But those are daily threats, daily scoldings, daily humiliations of Japan coming out of the party state. Chinese Communist Party is the state in the People's Republic of China. So what you see coming out on a daily basis through their propaganda organs is intense psychological warfare, intense media warfare against Japan. Now, you might say, as some do, I've talked to in State Department, well, no one really reads that. Yes, they do. And then it's picked up those articles in Xinhua, those articles in China Daily, People's Daily. They're picked up and given bounce by international news media, some under the control of the PRC, but just other news media in general will give bounce to those threats, magnifying the intensity of the impact of the psychological warfare. Does that alone win the day? No, but it's all part of a widespread, again, what I call a combined arms attack that over time corrodes confidence, corrodes the ability, the will of a people to resist. Again, the threat of nuclear attack. Recently, we're going to drop atomic bombs on Japan, bomb after bomb, until Japan, quote, surrenders again. These threats are terrifying to a nation that has been nuked. If the people of Japan, to hear that, It's okay, just give China what they want. Okay, that way we won't get nuked again. So yeah, these propaganda organs, this media warfare, the strategic psychological warfare, does have an impact over time. So again, this is just some examples of the military, how the military intimidation ties into the part of their three warfares, the strategic psychological operations, and then their media warfare. It's all tied together. Elite capture, you can talk about that if you want. A lot, just like in the United States, the PRC has been pretty successful co-opting, bribing, coercing, enticing with honey traps, sexual enticement, elected officials, business leaders, using blackmail, bribery, coercion, persuasion, all the same tools that they've been so successful co-opting a good number of America's elites. They've used pretty successfully over the years in Japan. And Japan has fewer laws against that. It has fewer internal defenses that help them fight against that kind of invasive subversion from the PRC. Again, elite capture, and goes into the political parties. The LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, is the overwhelmingly dominant party in Japan right now, but it has a pro-Beijing, a pro-CCP faction in it. The Democratic Party of Japan, which ruled from 2009 to 2012 and got into trouble and is no longer in power, in part because it was so obsequious to China, didn't stand up very well to them. Again, they have a very pro-CCP faction in it. So it's insidious, the infiltration within Japan's elites, the media as well. They're on Okinawa, which is a key political warfare battleground. Many of in fact, all the major news media there have either informal or informal relationships with the Xinhua and with other PRC propaganda organs. Imagine that, signing agreements with a totalitarian state propaganda organs. And you're from a democratic country that they want to overthrow. But that's the nature of the Okinawa news media.